Thank you very much for coming. My name is Linda McCarthy. I work for the Downtown Missoula Partnership. We are one of a handful of partners that have put this workshop together. City Development Services, Missoula Redevelopment Agency, the Downtown Business Improvement District, and the Missoula Downtown Association have funded today's workshop. We really appreciate you taking the time to come spend the day or portions of your day with us. We think this is a good step in the right direction. We did the Downtown Master Plan, our 20-year vision for the future of Downtown Missoula in 2007, 2008. We were talking at that time about design and build-to-lot lines and how we want sort of the future of our downtown to look. But we were in the midst of rewriting the city zoning code. And so it wasn't really the right time for us to address the regulatory components of the Downtown Master Plan. So we set that aside for a bit. Of course, the economy tanked, building stopped, and we moved into survival mode. A couple years later, we kind of started talking about it again with the Downtown Master Plan implementation team as it relates to sort of new activity coming into the marketplace, how we get housing into downtown, how we separate the sort of the commercial components of our downtown from the residential components of downtown, sort of protecting our traditional neighborhoods adjacent to our downtown. And again, at that time, I think that was probably 2011, we opted again to set aside that regulatory piece and not deal with the design guidelines per se. Over the course of the last 3 years, we've seen some new projects come into the marketplace, and a couple of them have been flashpoints for community discussion on what we want our community to look like, whether we should incentivize or regulate standards that present the community of Missoula in the way that we want it to. And so, again, lots of conversations happening around that. Many new members of City Council coming into play and really wanting to address this in their tenure. And we had an opportunity that presented itself that we couldn't turn down. Nori Winter, here to my right, is one of the most well-known professionals in the country with design standards, and he has worked with countless communities across America, from Asheville, North Carolina to the city of Los Angeles. He and Brad Johnson, back here in the back room, are both here from Winter and Company, which is a consulting firm out of Boulder, Colorado. They're here working on the master plan for the Scott Street Urban Renewal District. So they've been partnered up with WGM, and I think this is their third visit doing workshop planning for that urban renewal district. So while they were here, we put together this workshop. And I know it's Friday before a 3-day weekend, and there's lots of things going on, but we are so grateful for you spending some time with us today. We have broken out the workshop into components so that you can come and go as you need to. There is coffee in the back room, restrooms across the way. There will be a break for lunch. We do have MCAT here. Thank you, Ron, for helping us out with that. So that we've recorded the session and it will be available to anybody who can't be here today. And Laval Means will be sort of our staff person on site for the duration of the day. We will end the day with an open house, sort of a summary of what the day's activities included. And then coming out of this process, we hope there will be sort of some next step recommendations for the city to look at and potentially implement as we roll things out. So thank you again for coming, and I'll turn it over to Nori Winter. Thank you for being here today, Nori.
I noticed someone was setting up a microphone earlier. Are we supposed to be using that?
If you want it, if it's there if you want it.
I didn't know if it's so this to help with
It is helpful for MCAT.
It is helpful for MCAT. Okay, we will use it. Good morning.
We are going to have a action-filled day. The general objective is to provide an overview of some of the ways in which communities have been addressing community character through different incentive-based programs, regulatory programs, et cetera. Two of the key tools that have been in discussion here and elsewhere are through zoning codes, the new approach of form-based codes that focus more on design, as well as design review guidelines. We'll talk about the differences, how they work, pros and cons of them, show some results along the way. But a lot of the day is planned for you to help provide ideas about how important is design and the quality of development to Missoula, and is there a role that any of those tools should play here, or how should the city proceed to promote what we would call design excellence. We've worked with some other communities across the country in this kind of a project, and so we're going to be sharing some of those ideas. First, I wanted to show you what happens when you Google Missoula buildings. Actually, what happens when you Google recent or new Missoula buildings. These, I hope, are all from Missoula, but you know Google sometimes does make a mistake. But I thought it'd be kind of interesting just to sort of see what people see when they're cruising the web and thinking about Missoula. So they're presented without comment, but just as a means of getting us all sort of fresh a little bit here. And then immediately after that, I'm going to ask all of you all to sort of introduce yourselves a little bit, and we'll also explain a little bit more about who we are and what our experience is around the country. But I thought it'd be fun to kind of put, first of all, a picture in our minds of what people are seeing. So some of these may be your buildings. And again, we're not making any editorial comments at this stage of the game. But this is what is considered potentially recent trends. Am I not lit? Oh, okay. Now, make no claim about being representative or inclusive in terms of everything that's going on. Again, this is what's making the internet. Well, we're not quite ready for Mike just yet. So with that in your mind, I'd like to hear just real briefly who you are, what your interest is being here today. So just some real quick, speedy introductions. If we could start with this table back here, sir. Would you be number one and introduce yourself? Yes, you.
My name is Eric Lefty. I'm an architect.
Great. Okay.
Scott Anderson, estimator for a construction company.
Okay.
Leslie Schwab, Historic Preservation Officer for City of Missoula.
John Rettenmeyer, just an interested citizen.
Liz Russo-Millar with the University of Montana. Gwen Reinquist with the University of Montana.
Ryan Smith, Lansing Park.
Sam Sullivan, the Government Affairs Director at the Chamber.
Carmen Gilligan, interested.
Steve Labor. I'm on the Government Affairs Committee for the Missoula Building Industry Association.
I'm Tony Moretti, I'm an architect.
Jillian Thornton, I'm a graduate student at the university.
Great. Start with this table next. Yes, ma'am.
Debbie Williams, Missoula Midtown Association.
Gwen Jones, City Council, Ward 3.
Eric Gaster with the Missoula Midtown Association.
Ruth Renicky, Board of the MRA.
Corey Eldridge, Missoula Urban Transportation District.
Ben Weiss, Bicycle Pedestrian Program Manager for the city.
My name's Andy Short, Territorial Landworks. I'm a land use consultant.
Great. Sure.
Matt Smith, civil engineer.
Dick Ainsworth, retired after 4 years of owned solely an engineering planning business. President of June Planning Board, City County.
Heidi West, Ward 1. See.
John Belloc, a land use planner with PCI.
Okay.
I'm Tom Zavitz with the City of Missoula Development Services.
Jim McLeod, Fair and Local Partners, we're a local real estate development firm.
Harold Nelson, architect, consultant, and academic.
Ann Nelson, co-chair of the Captain John Mullen Neighborhood Council.
Heather McMillan, I'm the housing director for Homeward, nonprofit developer.
I'm Jeremy Keenan, WGM Group.
You've already met Linda.
Aaron Wilson, a transportation planner with the Missoula Metropolitan Planning Organization.
Alicia Vanderheiden, program specialist with the Transportation Division, City of Missoula.
I'm Mike Haynes. I am the Development Services Director.
And Mike's going to give us a short briefing in a minute just to sort of let us know what the current regulations and tools are that are in operation in the city. Linda already told you a little bit about Winter & Company. We are a planning and urban design firm. We're based in Boulder. We have had the opportunity of working with a lot of communities in developing neighborhood and downtown plans, but also a lot of work in the realm of writing design guidelines and in working in teams with firms that specialize in writing zoning codes, especially form-based codes. And as she mentioned, right now we are working on the Los Angeles zoning code, which is the biggest planning project in the country, I think, going on right now. And our responsibility is to look at compatibility and context in terms of trying to make the zoning code more context sensitive. So it's a really interesting assignment. We've also worked in many Rocky Mountain Western towns. We cut our eye teeth in our historic mining resort towns. We've written guidelines for Aspen, Steamboat, Telluride, Crested Butte, Park City, Utah, Bozeman, and I'm forgetting, Ketchum, and many others, as well as larger cities all across the country. We've done a lot of work in historic preservation in terms of helping to set up historic districts and write design guidelines for historic districts. We are presently wrapping up guidelines for Mobile, Alabama. We just finished them for Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania recently. We just heard yesterday that we're going to have the pleasure of writing preservation guidelines for Houston. And that's going to be an interesting challenge since Houston doesn't have zoning. So that's a new way of fitting design review into city planning. It's going to be really fun. So anyway, we know just enough to be dangerous in the field, and we know that each community has to find its own way in terms of how it feels about character and community and design, and which tools fit best. And I hope we'll help to lay a little bit of a foundation this morning that'll help you then in providing some guidance to the city here. We know enough about what works and also some of the pitfalls along the way. That said, before we get into the other areas of discussion, we wanted Mike to sort of give us a little bit of an overview of what some of the basic tools are that are in place right now. So I'll turn it over to you. And pushing the right arrow will advance the slides.
All right. Again, Mike Haynes, Development Services Director for the city. What I'm here to do today, just for the next few minutes, is to show you some existing regulations that we have in place. So this will hopefully be a foundation for the rest of the discussions today. I have to say, looking at those images, there's a lot of very attractive buildings in Missoula, and I think we've seen some great development over recent years. to use Linda's word, but we have had a few flashpoints, and I think that's really the impetus for the discussion about design. So we do have some standards in place today, and I just want to go through those. First of all, we have enterprise commercial use standards. So as you can see on the slide here, this relates to buildings over 30,000 square feet. So it's what I would call big bucks standards, essentially. They do apply to new construction and expansions of greater than 20% in all commercial zoning districts, as well as M1R and M1, which are our two mixed-use zoning districts. And as you can see on the board, they address the location of the building. Typically, you would expect to find buildings of this size on arterial streets, and that's expected. If not, there is a requirement for a traffic impact analysis. And again, talking about big box, typically you've got outdoor storage, so there are standards for screening of outdoor storage and screening and landscaping of parking areas, provision of some outdoor usable space, and also some requirements in terms of sidewalks, crosswalk, and pedestrian connections, inclusion in the urban transportation district, and of course, large developments like this, you would anticipate there would be some transit facilities that would be available, and also some standards for facades for new buildings and expansions of 50% or greater, and you can see that there. And typically these standards, when we have facade standards, they relate to some modulation of the facades, variation in color and materials, roof lines, some minimum amount of doors and windows for some transparency and those kind of things. And that is the case with these commercial standards. We do have standards for multi-dwelling buildings as well, so apartments and condominiums. And I think those have been pretty successful when you look at some of the new projects we've seen around town. They apply to new construction and expansions that result in additional living units. And those standards include step backs in terms of heights from our districts. So that relates to compatibility with single-family neighborhoods and less intense development. Sidewalks, crosswalks, and pedestrian connections again. Surface parking areas can't be in the front of the building, so the parking needs to be in the rear or to the side of the building. And again, there's some requirements there for some building design standards, and also for some storage areas. So just in the past month, we've adopted, or should I say, the commercial uses not exceeding 30,000 square feet. These standards have literally become effective within the last 30 days or so. City Council saw that we were getting some buildings that did not really meet the standards that the city has, or at least the standards that we aspire to. And they saw that while we had the enterprise commercial standards for larger buildings, there was a gap in terms of smaller buildings. So towards the end of last year, we went through a process of establishing these standards that are outlined here. Again, they apply to the commercial zoning districts, M1 and M1R. And they address building orientation. So again, parking has to be in the rear or the side, and the buildings must be oriented to the street. There must be at least one customer entrance facing the street. And again, there's design standards, a list of design alternatives for these building facades, depending on their visibility from the street. So in all three of these sets of standards that I'm talking about here, no one's dictating architecture or materials or anything like that. all it's doing is establishing a menu of options and asking that there be some minimum standards met in the appearance of buildings. Something else that we're requiring, and that is when we review for these commercial design standards, we'll also be looking at the signage at the same time. And definitely signs have become quite an issue in the last few months. Two last things. So both of those apply citywide, the standards that I was just talking about in those commercial and mixed-use districts. But we do have a pedestrian overlay district that was created at the same time as Title 20 was adopted in 2009. It hasn't actually been applied anywhere in the city yet, but this is part of our zoning code. So as it states right there, the intent is to preserve and enhance the character of pedestrian-oriented streets, and in turn to promote street-level activity, economic vitality, and pedestrian safety and comfort. So I think these were definitely intended to apply to some specific neighborhoods, and you can see the standards there. They relate to the placement of buildings. Again, they have to be at or close to the property line. Some minimum standards of glazing, doors and entrances, again, and a requirement for a minimum amount of ground floor commercial space, including minimum floor to height ceilings, which is pretty common, and a requirement that active uses be in place. And of course, those are retail, restaurant, bars, personal improvement, and art studios, those kind of uses that really are vibrant and attract a lot of use. And finally, we do have overlay districts. The one that I'm really focusing on here is the South Side Riverfront district. That's a corridor, that's Russell Street from the river, essentially to South 4th Street. And the intent of that overlay was to get away from, excuse me, to get away from the auto-oriented uses and to more neighborhood and pedestrian-oriented uses. So those standards, they do prohibit uses like gas stations, auto repair, drive-through restaurants, and mini warehouses. And the intent is that over time, the commercial uses will transition to those that really support the neighborhood. Again, there's a requirement for the orientation of buildings and the location of parking. And again, some building design standards, facade, entryways, and glazing. So those are some of the standards that we have in place today. And just a reminder that whatever we do moving forward, we can certainly have standards or guidelines that apply to the city as a whole. We can have standards that apply to corridors or to nodes of activity or to neighborhoods. So there's always that flexibility as it is established and as it's applied to the to zoning districts and the zoning map that we have. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. If not, I'll hand it back to Nori. Thank you.
So after seeing those photographs and understanding what the current system is, what's your impression right now about character and design in Missoula? Any quick comments, thoughts, concerns, issues, successes? Are we doing great? No, we're not doing great. What's your concern? Just
I get my impression from those pictures was that there are some good-looking buildings, but there's no theme or no consistency or no character for the community.
So good design, but maybe not relating to the community at all, in all cases. Anyone else? Observations about what you saw in those photographs? Or yes, sir.
This whole new row house exception that Missoula has just received from Helena is sort of one of those things that makes everything vulnerable, all your guidelines, standards, everything is vulnerable to external political action. And I didn't see anything about that up there as a land use, but
So the row house exception, townhouse exception, an external ruling.
Act, it implies a lot of things that's sort of relevant to this, but I didn't see it as part of that.
Okay, so we may want to come back and talk about that a little bit. Yeah, Tom?
I could answer that.
Oh, okay, then great. Thank you. No, go right ahead. Go right ahead.
So that has more to do with subdivision type developments and not necessarily design in this type of sense visually necessarily. It's more of numbers of units going into residential areas. It's an exception to subdivision regulations.
But the standards too, it's like road requirements, open space, all of those things.
The same ones that you would find in subdivision, right? So, and that relates to design to some degree, right?
So
But not totally directly, right?
So this meeting is not going to engage the question of subdivision?
I don't think so.
Just so we know.
Right.
I would say that I have mixed feelings. The flashpoints are definitely, I like that word. It's kinder than I would use. I think MRA has done an incredible job of supplying a carrot when it comes to the districts that they work in. There's been some phenomenal projects there. And I think that without the new commercial standards, which now I'm very curious as to how these will be implemented on projects 30,000 or less, we've had some very embarrassing points in Missoula, and it's very frustrating overall. And I'm looking forward and I'm applauding the city and everybody for being forth the effort, whether it be a hard conversation or not. It's about time we sat down and talked about this as a community.
Okay, great, thanks. Anyone else? Quick observations, thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
Drive around the city looking for good examples of infill in the historic districts. I see there's a wide variety of context-sensitive and not very context-sensitive design solutions out there. So I think, design guidelines might be a good tool to kind of bring some consistency in that.
So compatibility of infill in the historic districts, big issue. Okay, Tom?
And then my quick comment, which kind of came out of our growth policy and our speaker that came, which was, when I see those buildings, do they tell me where I am? Do I say, oh, I'm in Missoula, I'm in Montana,
Is there a sense of place? Okay. Yes, sir.
I think, in response to a couple of different comments here, one thing about Missoula, especially the downtown area and also a lot of the older neighborhoods, is that there is a theme. And the theme that there is that there isn't a theme. And there's a certain amount of when there is creativity, when there's eclectic mixes of certain kinds of buildings, we tend to enjoy that here more than maybe others might. So I think there's this really fine edge of where stuff really doesn't belong and is inconsistent, and where we're looking at something that is just different and may actually fit into our real psyche for how we.
So a couple of points there. Diversity may be a part of what makes Missoula, Missoula, but within a range of deviation, if you will. And the other is that sometimes just reacting to change is what we're seeing as opposed to some other kind of response. Yes, sir.
I tend to agree. When we were looking at the slides there, I felt a fairly broad and some diversity, and I like to see that rather than all the same. I think you could go through that list of slides and you could find several buildings that some people in this room would think were beautiful and others that people would think were pretty ugly. And I think it would be tough to, there might be a couple flashpoints that we might have some agreement on. But there's some in there that I think I would find ugly and others in this room would think were really nice.
So to what extent is it beauty in the eye of the beholder, or are there some fundamental aspects of community that everyone could agree on or not? And I've got you first, maybe.
Just looking at the newly built multi-residential areas or constructions, I'm seeing that 15% window as not being enough. I don't think there's anything up there that I saw that addressed the issue of comfort for the residents within the units. There are no guidelines for that I know. So if you're going to put up a 15-foot wall and only require a window that's 36 inches wide, it's not enough.
So designing for livability and the percentage of windows. Okay, all right. Yes.
I was just going to say, I think Missoula has an amazing history, an amazing architectural history in this town. And neighborhoods in downtown, there's some incredibly beautiful areas. But what I see is, I think we need to really look at the past and pull from that core and help to create our identity for the next future, because in some of those areas it's just being obliterated. It's not being honored. And I think it is a flexible community. I don't think we want to be painted into the corner with, now this will never change ever, ever, ever. But I think it needs to be part of our fabric as we look forward. I think our history is very important.
So learning from the past without being trapped in it, perhaps. Okay. Anyone else? Any other quick comments? Yes.
I just have a quick comment about scale, and it's hard to see actually from those pictures, but when I share photos on social media outlets, a lot of the comments I get are about the scale of the buildings within the landscape as a whole, and that they're not overriding the neighboring hills. It's not taking over from the natural landscape, and we appreciate that. That's part of the character.
So the relationship to the landscape and the open spaces and the mountains is a part of the design character of Missoula. Okay. All right. Great observation. Very, very interesting idea. Oh, yeah, Jeremy.
So when I was looking at those pictures, I was thinking about maybe some pictures that weren't up there where we almost got it right. We got the design of the building was about 90% of the way there, but there were a few small details that they missed. And I think those new small commercial standards address some of those things like entrances onto the street and screening utilities and things like that tend to end up with. But one of our challenges, I think, is the idea of having a building that fronts the street but the parking is behind. And I think for the architects in the room, how do you do that in a way that works for that business or residential building that's there?
Anyone else? Quick observation? Yes, sir.
The pictures didn't show the next great thing. The French hated the Eiffel Tower. The Australian Sydney hated their Sydney Opera House. So I'm wondering, I'm fifth generation from this area, I'm wondering if Missoula, what's the next great thing for Missoula other than being a Western town? What's the possibility for something great to happen? Regulations, controls, reaction to existing doesn't necessarily help that.
Mm-hmm. And you may be also pointing out a distinction between what we would call civic and landmark structures from the background building fabric of a neighborhood, for example. Years ago, we were working on design guidelines for Carmel, California. And if any of you know Carmel, it's got terminal charm. But it's a very interesting place, and people there very much care about that character. And one of the residents who was concerned about the design guidelines potentially over-regulating and stifling creativity said, well, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright did a house here. Would he be able to do it under these guidelines? And so we pulled up the house, and I don't know if you know this particular house, but it's out on a rocky point on the coastline there. And while its style was very, very different, it was a very quiet house that fit with the landscape, that used the same materials palette, and the lesson they came to realize was that there were more fundamental characteristics of what makes Carmel than style. because they also have some very distinctive stylistic buildings, if any of you have seen the sort of fairy tale cottages that they have there. And people were afraid, oh my God, we're going to require everyone to have those little fairy tale houses, and that wasn't at all the case. So it's an interesting distinction there between what fits in, what's compatible without being stifling, and understanding what those fundamental aspects are of building sometimes is a good place to start. Any other quick observations? Yes, Heidi?
So when we're talking about individual buildings, I think you have to look at the bigger picture of where it would fit in the overall livability of the community. So I feel really fortunate to live somewhere where I can walk pretty much everywhere I need to go, but parts of town aren't designed that way, and I think that's something we need to try and recoup maybe in some places. The livability and access to open spaces and non-motorized travel, I think that should be part of it.
So how does design and development contribute to walkability, to bikeability, to alternative modes, to connections between neighborhoods? So there's some larger kind of planning relationships that even an individual project might in some way help to connect the dots. Okay? Anyone else? Concerns, worries, successes, general observations about what you saw? Yeah.
I guess I would just add that while it might be a flashpoint to talk about this, I think Bozeman does a really good job. And I know that they're different, and Missoula's different. I'm fifth generation Gallatin Valley. I've been here 20 years, okay, so I know both sides of the equation. But I say I don't want to be afraid to look at what they do, because I know there's certain projects built in Bozeman that are built in Missoula, and they look totally different, and they are more Montana than they are in Bozeman than they are here. So you look at what they do, maybe it's not the same, but it can be captured. Be afraid. I think that's a good comparison. What works, what doesn't work, and how can we capture Missoula's character in the guidelines and have them be successful.
Okay. Well, we're going to test your ability to help define what Missoula's character is here in a little bit. So you're going to get to do that. Yeah, Mike?
Yeah, I just want to mention that I think from staff's point of view, as well as from a number of folks on City Council, I think one of our challenges is national brands, national chains. And, I think local businesses are much more likely to be sensitive to the context that they're building and that they're designing in. And I think one of our major challenges is how we ensure that when national chains build in Missoula, that they do that being sensitive to this community.
Very good point, and we will have an opportunity to talk about that a little bit here in a little while. So, anyone else? We're ready to move into a little bit of looking at learning from some other communities maybe here in a minute. Yes, sir.
I should have asked Mike this question during his talk, but my understanding is that the enterprise commercial is not implemented in the CBD, in the Central Business District, and so what are the tools that we have at our disposal to help steer design within our downtown, and how do we preserve or maintain character in that downtown without that?
Well, we're certainly going to talk about the tools, but do you have any immediate response?
I guess, again, I think enterprise commercial was really, in my view, is really big box standards, and that's really not a development type that's an issue downtown. But I think we could and should look at specific standards for the downtown area. Downtown is great, and it's definitely some, we want to preserve the character that we see in downtown and maybe export that to some other parts of the city.
Okay, give me a minute here I'm ready to switch over to another PowerPoint, I believe, here. Now, there is always a risk of showing what anyone else has done in any other community. So, You all appreciate that. I'm tossing out a lot of ideas here as food for thought and to share with you what others have been doing, not as a suggestion that this is what would work here. And in fact, in some cases, learning what doesn't work is a profound lesson to learn. And so I've collected a few slides that are going to randomly jump around the country into some different contexts and show you different ways of different design results. And we're mostly focusing on buildings, although we'll touch a little bit on site design. I'm not really talking about signs. We may try to have some discussion about that a little bit, maybe right after lunch. We may have time to do that. I was going to show this earlier. This is my frequent flyer strategy map. This does show you where we've worked. Delaware has not seen the light, and we've not done a project in Delaware yet. But just about every other state we've done something in at one time or another. And we've gotten to understand why people are concerned about design and design excellence. Why do we even have this conversation? Some of you have already answered this for me. One is a concern of quality of life. This is our community, and this is where we are going to live our lives. And high quality experiences shouldn't be limited to when we go on vacation. It should be a daily experience that is right outside our door. Also because we want to have a sense of identity in our community. We do want to know that this is Missoula and not Bozeman. And that doesn't mean it has to have cow skulls and broken wagon wheels out in front of every house. We're not talking theme, but there might be something that says Missoula, and maybe it is a sense of connection to the outdoors. That might be it. Or it might be a materials palette or just a way of sitting on the ground in a respectful way. Also, it's to promote efficiency in urban design systems and circulation. Someone touched on connectivity. If I can go from property A to property B along a commercial corridor without having to drive back out onto the street again and add to the traffic volumes again, that is enhancing urban design systems. So sometimes cross-property connections along commercial corridors is a good principle from that standpoint. And today, more so than ever, to maintain a competitive edge. So much is changing in our lives, and particularly the way business is conducted. And many of you live here and telecommute or fly in your business around the world. And you choose to live here because of quality of life. And more, the kinds of creative class jobs are locating in these kinds of places. And so to be competitive, that is a part of why design excellence is important. Now, people are concerned about overregulation, about dictating styles and solutions, and rightfully so. What we've learned in working with the development community and with property owners across the country is they say, we can work with a system that has these features, that's fair, predictable, and efficient. Fair in that the rules apply to us equally. It's not because you and I had a personal disagreement last month about the fact that I haven't mowed my lawn. The rules apply to us equally. And it's predictable. If I make a good faith effort to follow the rules, I can expect to come out in a timely manner with the approvals. It's not a murky system that I have to wander through and get caught in a do loop, never knowing how it's all going to come out. There are examples of that across the country. We all know those war stories. And it's efficient in that everyone's time is used efficiently. We're not asking our architects to redesign buildings. We're not using staff time on reviews of projects that ought to have been streamlined and go right through the permitting process. And the community also wants this. As a neighbor in a historic neighborhood, I want to be able to anticipate the character and scale of the house that might be built next to me next year. Not that I'm going to know what style it is, but the general character and form and scale and relationship to the site. I shouldn't be surprised. And quite often we are today. So, what are the basic concepts for what I would call character management? That's sort of taking the broad spectrum from a zoning regulation to a design guideline system and the different ways in which they are applied across the country. One is, of course, they are built on adopted policies. The vision plan, the comprehensive plan, the growth strategy, all of those things, so that they are consistent with that. The tools are easy to use, they're easy to understand, the words are clear, there are pictures that help to illustrate them. They do actually help to raise the bar and inspire higher quality development, sometimes just by showing pictures of things that people like. And doing so, they're going to help enhance property values and enhance the economy. Good guidelines and or zoning standards or other kinds of tools like that are also solution-oriented, as opposed to those that say what you can't do. They say what you can and what is desired and what you're encouraged to do. And today, they should also incorporate sustainable design concepts throughout and anticipate that. So those are some key characteristics that a good character management system will have. Now, we've also already sort of touched on a little bit of this, but these systems are a balancing act of property rights and a consideration of community and individuals. They are a balance between being very simple. A simple rule is, the building can be no more than 4 stories tall. Well, the fact of the matter is, in that particular context, I could probably design a nice 5, 6, or 7-story building that might be varied in mass that could fit in very well. So the one-size-fits-all rule of a building can only be 4 stories tall may be overly simplistic. On the other hand, if I'm going to say, yeah, maybe varied massing could work, I've got to start talking about how you do that without dictating a design. That starts getting a little more complicated. So somewhere in there is the balancing of those ideas. It's certainly the consideration of if I'm the owner of the property making the improvements or if I'm the guy next door seeing it happen. And those are two perspectives that both need to be respected. And then pulling back at an even larger level that there certainly are individual property rights. They're fundamental to the way in which we deal in our world. But also there's the public good and the public benefit that we've been touching on and how that's considered in that respect as well. I think we've all understood the old concept of basic zoning of the rendering plant being next door to the school and that there was something inappropriate about that and that there was some appropriate role of regulation in the way in which individual property development contributes to community good. So we're raising some concerns about some of these different contexts. Downtowns, and how do you maintain the character of a downtown? The virtue of downtown Missoula is that it does have a very strongly established context that is fabulous. It doesn't mean you should necessarily copy it, but you can learn from it and you can analyze it in a way that you could help identify what might constitute compatibility in that setting. There are corridors, the commercial strip corridors that America's done a fabulous job of creating that are very entertaining for our cars. They love it. But the rest of us don't when we become pedestrians or bicyclists. And that's an area of focus where a lot of transformation is going on in corridors for a variety of reasons. We've learned we need to limit our vehicular usage. We've learned that we need to increase density to accommodate an increasing population, and the corridors are one place that we can do that without disrupting established neighborhoods. And so in many cases, that's an area of transformation as opposed to holding back a bit the way we might in our downtowns. Big boxes are a part of corridors maybe, but they are a separate animal to some extent because they are so big. And then there are what we would call transitions, the edges between whether it's downtown or commercial corridors or other kinds of uses to more sensitive uses, i.e. single-family neighborhoods, and how that happens. We used to call it buffering in old zoning terms, and that implied we don't know what to do about it, so we're going to put up a fence. Nowadays, the thinking is that edge ought to be a positive edge that actually links neighborhoods in a compatible way to those goods and services. So I don't have to get in my car to drive around the block to get a quart of milk. And then there are the neighborhoods themselves. So we're going to touch on all of these a little bit here this morning. Does that sound like something you want to do? Okay. All right, well, my hometown, I got to show you Boulder. Now, don't try this in your living room, kids. I mean, Boulder is a very unique place, but there's some very good lessons to learn there, even though I'm not necessarily promoting our regulatory system. But this is the downtown Pearl Street during the construction of our famous pedestrian mall in 1976. People had enough foresight to recognize that something was going to change. It wasn't just keeping the street the way it was. This was a big change. This was our Eiffel Tower, if you will. But it did work as a framework for retaining and reinvesting in the established building stock there, which is our traditional turn of the 19th to 20th century Western, Midwestern commercial blocks, primarily masonry, transparent first floors, upper floors more solid with punctured openings in them, horizontal moldings aligning roughly down the street, etc., cornices capping buildings, generally buildings reflecting the modules of the lots on which they sat. So if you had one lot, you were this wide. If you had two lots, you were that wide. But often there were some vertical elements or articulation that reflected that gave a sense of scale to the street. We then, in the early 80s, had a developer who said he was going to bring the new context to downtown Boulder. And there were no design review systems. The local preservation advocacy organization sat down with this developer and said, please, won't you consider being more respectful? And he said, no, I'm giving you the new Eiffel Tower. This is the new Boulder. Well, this was our flashpoint. And people said, no, thank you. We don't want any more of this. And so Boulder did set up a design review system for the downtown area. Now, the system it set up was one in which what we would call was advisory. That is, you were required to come in to meet with the design review committee and get a check on your box application for your building permit, but you didn't have to get their approval. It was just a required discussion. Now, that said, for many people in Boulder, you wanted something extra from the city. There were always conditional uses or something you wanted. And so there was a carrot and a stick that also applied. So in truth, most projects had to follow the new guidelines. But it still was because you were stepping over the base permitted zoning in some form or another that triggered that. So that's an advisory review system. So the next building, or there's maybe 2 or 3 buildings later, was built on this parking lot, replacing this parking lot. Now, this parking lot is interesting because I'm standing here, and behind me now is the new 4-block Pearl Street Mall emerging and getting vital and very, very active in terms of retail and office business, et cetera. You would come to this end of the 4 blocks, and you would stand and you'd look there, and it was kind of vacant and a couple of buildings down the way. Generally, pedestrians stopped there and turned around and went back. And so even though there were some good businesses along here, they never saw the foot traffic that the 4 blocks of the mall saw. So this building was built there. Now, this is a single structure. It was designed to be contemporary for its time, mid-'80s, I guess, reflecting that traditional module, if you will, of building fronts and the proportion of transparency or glass and horizontal moldings, but done with detailing that when you looked at it, you knew that it was a new building and of its time. The other interesting thing about it was that it is actually a 450-car parking structure wrapped with shallow retail and office uses. And you've all seen now examples emerging like this around the country, which was nice. It's pretty, it fits in. It extended the sense of the mall. What it also really did was energize 4 more blocks of commercially zoned property that never were seeing the pedestrian traffic, because now people started walking an extra block and there was a ripple effect in terms of investment down the street. So that we've at least doubled the length of the Pearl Street pedestrian-oriented retail experience because of good design. So that was an interesting lesson. The guidelines also, though, addressed other things, certainly rehabilitation of historic buildings, but even sort of little nondescript things like this, you know, turning into these commercial spaces. And we all love those kinds of before and afters. They're heartwarming, but it also was good economic development. Now, later on in the evolution of thinking in Boulder, the very core of the mall was designated as an historic district locally, and so it is subject to the Preservation Commission's review. The remaining part of the downtown is still subject to this design advisory board that operates in this sort of gray area between regulation and advice. And so down that block continued to be this kind of infill. So more vacant lots and more historic buildings being renovated along the way, old and new together, increasing density, but having a variety of scale, stepping back, because we have a very low scale tradition, lower scale than you do for your downtown. But you can see the way in which those same principles of articulation, of maintaining a sort of sense of scale of first floor, et cetera, were being applied here. And this is a project that then turns the corner, and these are multifamily units that are part of that same development that act as that transition to the single family properties behind them. And yet another one. So all of this is now, here's that parking structure. Now we've got these extra 4 blocks of hot commercial and mixed use. Now, a street off of Pearl is Canyon Boulevard, if any of you know Boulder. That's where we had our urban renewal authority, and several blocks were cleared where we were going to have super blocks built, all interconnected in great ways, but not really thinking much about the pedestrian environment or the street scene. And we got freestanding, auto-oriented commercial buildings, Anywhere USA commercial corridor. This has now been replaced with buildings that fit the guidelines in terms of massing and scale, defining the street edge, creating that pedestrian experience along the way. So we've got retail, office, and residential in a mixed-use environment. Lesson being here, that's what can happen to a commercial corridor when there's the opportunity for investment in it. Now, however, we also have learned some lessons about what can go wrong, I think, in some respects. We wrote some design guidelines for Bloomington, Indiana, several years ago. And the guidelines remained voluntary, but the city took about 4 or 5 of the key principles and codified them. And one was requiring articulation and variation. And there was a menu. You could do it with changing in and out and or changing materials. The intent being to help reduce the perceived mass of a building and help it look like it maybe is a series of smaller buildings. Well, what went wrong here? That didn't work. This still looks like one building, right? So just saying you need to have articulation or vary materials without talking about what is the intent can misfire. Because what's happened here is they used this same material that runs all the way across. So what it does is defeat the purpose of trying to divide this into a series of what would be perceived as being separate modules. And so it's sort of be careful about what you may get what you ask for unless you aren't very careful about what your intent is and what you're asking for and how it happens. Another example in Bloomington was this one. Same thing going on. Working very hard to break up the mass, and all it does, there's a point at which if you break it down too much, it's back into being a big box again. And so the nuance of how you handle massing and materials are very important. The other lesson here was, even though you may be varying it this way, there's no variation in building height or massing here, which could have been accomplished even by providing some balconies and outdoor spaces for some of those units, which could have added value to them, if nothing else. As opposed to back at our parking garage, where here at least, and it's not the perfect design necessarily, but at least they understood that if you're going to do work with articulation in one way, then you don't mess it up by overlaying something that's working contradictory to that. Part of that is understanding the basic framework of what makes our downtowns. And we struggle with height limits and regulations, but in many cases in a downtown, it's the variation in height. Someone talked about diversity. Well, diversity in massing is also a part of the characteristics of many of our downtowns, not just diversity of style. And so it's understanding how that might play out. This is Columbia, Missouri, and this is a set of guidelines written for their downtown organization. So these were written not for the city, but for their business improvement district, and they call themselves the district. And so they are voluntary guidelines, not mandatory. But the city does have a site plan review process that does provide for public comment on development over a certain scale in downtown Columbia. And any developer knows that if they want to make it through that hearing, on first hearing, they'd better have the endorsement of the district. And so they will come before the design review committee of the district, which is voluntary, to get their endorsement before they go before the planning commission. So this is another blend of how design review and design guidelines happen. We'll be talking about other models. But the main point here was to look at the fact that when we looked at the street, there was a range between 2 and 3 stories that was predominant for most of the area. And even the taller buildings reflected that in the way in which their skin was designed. There were horizontal elements, moldings, or changes in materials, or something that helped to establish that lower level scale of the street. And it helped people there think about how that actually taller buildings could fit in, as long as you understood that sort of basic framework of scale that defined the block edge there. So that was an interesting lesson there about massing. And that translated here, this is a series of guidelines out of Aspen, downtown, talking about the same concept, distinguishing absolute maximum height from the overall general height of an individual project. This is an illustration of a single development. And this is the maximum floor area that is allowed on that site. So the point here is that there's a potential building envelope that does go up to this height limit, but you can't fill that box totally with square footage. The floor area ratio is set below that box, which automatically provides for variety in building massing and form without dictating a particular shape. You'll see some standards that do a kind of wedding cake requirement. You got to step back after the second floor and go back and up and whatnot, which sometimes makes sense but may not work at all for the floor plan of a building. And sometimes you want to be able to have that tall element right at the street edge, if nothing else for an exit stair or something like that, that might make this building work. So this idea of variation in massing and massing that reflects the traditional development patterns is a part of the rules for design in downtown Aspen. This is an example from Ketchum of a similar kind of principle. The way in which it was applied here is a little bit different. The recommendations there were that the upper floors could only be a fraction of the floors below, a percentage. And I don't remember exactly what the numbers were, but the third floor could only be 75% of the footprint of the floor below, et cetera. You can move it around to fit your design need and your programmatic needs. So again, was saying absolute height isn't necessarily the issue. It's the way in which massing and square footage is arranged on the site that is the objective here. Also, along with that in Ketchum is a sense of the use of, I guess you would say, native materials, local materials, as a part of the building palette. And so many of the buildings there you will see are using wood and stone or concrete or other muted masonry materials as the primary building materials. Now there are exceptions. There are portions of buildings that are all glass in some cases or that are making use of architectural metals. But the predominant palette is one of natural materials, if you will. And you'll also see how they're working with the ideas of modulation, et cetera, articulation. This is a single building here. Certainly this one is, and these are. Now, part of what many of these communities have been promoting is the sense of there's more than one way to skin a cat. And Mike alluded to the fact that there are some menus embedded in the current zoning ordinance, some choices of how to meet a particular intent. And that idea of having an intent statement saying what is the real objective we're after, and then what are some ways of doing it is a way of providing for some flexibility. In a zoning ordinance, there may be a list of those 6 things in which you can do it. In guidelines, you can be even a little bit more flexible, and we'll talk about those differences a little bit later. That idea of transparency at the street level is a real popular one in downtown design guidelines. A certain percentage of the first floor must be transparent. The assumption is that it's going to be a retail storefront, which is great. Well, I have to fess up, our offices are in a new urbanist building that has storefront. We're on the street level. We get a lot of sun. The people working in front office have the glare. For 10 years, we've had boards up in our windows blocking out the light. So the idea of just requiring transparency is not an automatic guarantee of being pedestrian-oriented, animating the street, et cetera. So what might be some of the other alternatives? If the objective is to make it interesting for pedestrians to walk along and for there to be a sense of scale, well, here is a menu of options written for downtown Memphis for how you might do that. Wall art, other kinds of articulation, architectural details, even garage doors that are designed to be something interesting to walk by could be options in this particular context. Or in Goodyear, Arizona, and we'll talk about Goodyear a little bit more, trellises that have plant materials. Now, I know bougainvillea ain't gonna be the plant palette in Missoula, but the idea, and of course the other interesting thing about this is that even the lattice itself is something that adds texture and scale and shadow line, et cetera, to this, what would otherwise be a blank wall. So more than one way to skin a cat, thinking about options, thinking about variety, thinking about the different ways in which people might meet the intent of a pedestrian-friendly street edge is a part of what this is all about. Okay, let's move on a bit. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're fine here. Are you guys okay? We don't need a break or anything? So moving, now a lot of that I was talking about probably relates more to a downtown setting, although some of those same principles could apply to corridors or elsewhere. But let's move to the corridors for a bit. And so we're back in Boulder again, and this is 28th Street and some of our new areas with our big boxes. Again, you'll see a certain sense of detail and materials here that's a little bit different. And the point here is that just about every major corporate chain is operating somewhere in the country under design regulations and design guidelines, and they know how to do it. But they generally don't do it unless they're required to. My personal war story about that was early in my career when dealing with corporate franchises was quite intimidating for any of us. We were in Plymouth, Massachusetts. So imagine, very colonial architecture, tradition, et cetera, and we were dealing with a McDonald's. And this was about a sign, and the guy was beating the table saying, we've got to have this sign. This is the way we do it. There is no other way. And we had a very heated meeting. It didn't go anywhere. He left the room. And he left on the table, accidentally, the 10 backup negotiating positions that McDonald's had authorized. But he wasn't going to go from 1 to 2 unless we showed him that our rules said he had to. So, what's that? So just a little bit of a look at what's going on here. Big boxes are a challenge, and they're big, and they have to have a lot of blank wall. That's their very nature. But there are certainly ways of designing them to be more interesting as big boxes. And so here are staples. They're not bad. They've done all right with some color and materials and some screening of service areas. So we're seeing the interior here of the 29th Street development. This is the 28th Street edge of it. So these are all franchise businesses, every one of them a national corporation. There's maybe one local restaurant in here. This is the secondary entrance for these businesses. These are all double fronted. The primary entrances are over where the cars are parking in the interior of the block. But these are all doors, and then they've also got some outdoor use areas going on here. So here's Famous Footwear, for example. Now we don't think of Famous Footwear as being, promoters of grand urban design schemes around the country, but they somehow are managing to do business here. Here's Chipotle. So here's the 28th Street pedestrian edge with an outdoor dining area. Here's the other side. So it's double fronted. And these are what we, of course, call liner buildings in the profession. We get paid extra for using that term. But that's the idea, is that it is lining a parking lot behind which there's a big box. Some of these, and so the idea that is a real challenge in corridors because you've got to think about how things transform. This might be an old big box that gets remodeled, and there may be ways to add more of a liner building. Now, this is not the same as having 4 drive-through burger joints lined up along the street edge here. This is intentionally creating much more pedestrian-oriented activity than that, and also promoting that interconnection between individual properties. So I don't have to drive back out here and come back in over here as I'm conducting my business. Those are kind of fundamental concepts. These are illustrations out of the guidelines for Goodyear, Arizona. Goodyear is really interesting. I don't know if any of you know Goodyear. I never knew about Goodyear. It was named for Goodyear rubber. During World War II, they grew cotton here for the webbing for tires before steel radials. And so this entire company town was built around cotton fields. This is a suburb now of Phoenix. They have made good quality design a signature element of their economic development strategy. This to me was just totally amazing. This, totally auto-oriented desert town could do this. But so part of it is the idea, again, of double-fronted buildings. And so these are illustrations of the same buildings and how they relate to the interior of a development. And I'll come back to Goodyear later on, but here's an example of retrofitting a strip incrementally. And this is just a simple gas station in Boulder. Now, gas stations today typically have some sort of convenience store associated with them. That's the way they're all done now. And the typical model is that's set to the back of the lot. Well, here it's set to the corner, to anchor the corner. It's the same square footage, it's the same service area. There's no additional cost in terms of construction here at all. It's just where did you put the building on the site? And it was put on the corner to anchor the street and to be pedestrian oriented. Here are the, I can still get my gas there. That still works. Going back to 28th Street and going back a couple of decades, this is what our 28th Street looked like. And I'm sorry the photographs are so poor, but they're scanned from old slides. But you recognize it. Building set back from the street, an auto service area, a car dealership, some weeds, and a fast food joint over here. We're all apart. We're looking at a single site here that we'll come back to in a minute. It'll be the southwest corner of the intersection I'm going to take you around. Our downtown is way over here, and that retail energy is marching along this direction, and this is our major commercial corridor. This intersection of these four properties kind of represents the evolution in thinking of how you address a street edge in a corridor area, and I'm going to walk you through them. There's a Target, and they were the first ones to do something, and it was to basically do a very dense landscape buffer. And it actually is nice, and it kind of is that idea of reflecting the outdoors and the connection to nature. Just plant a lot of pines, is one way of doing that. Then up here is a restaurant anchored at the corner, and you'll see it there. There's no drive-through in front of it. There's an outdoor dining space on the corner. And so it's, again, bringing the building up to the corner. It's just real basic stuff. Let's see, how do I do that? Brad, how do I do there? So there's that one. Then you're going to see this building, which is a little strip commercial building flipped. So the parking is back here, and it frames the corner, and there's actually a pedestrian walkway leading up to the intersection. Again, same square footage, but double fronted, facing the street, same amount of parking. Now, here's a big box, and it gets retrofitted and rebuilt. This is while construction is going on. It's from what this is from. And you're going to see liner buildings appear here. This is where the auto dealership used to be. And this one does have to do with rethinking a little bit about big box and the strip and reducing the number of cars that you have to park and or parking them in a different way. In some cases, we certainly are over parking those areas. And this is the old Crossroads Mall. This is the area that got redeveloped with that 29th Street Men's Warehouse row and the big box and everything. That replaced this old 60s vintage mall. So what you're going to see is the blue dots are landscaping happening along the way, buffers, those buildings anchoring, new buildings coming in to define the edge here. So just walking through those, here's the landscape buffer, and it's deep. This is a pine edge. It's not just a little gesture of a couple of feet of planting. It's substantial. But somehow we all still are managing to find Target. They're doing fine. Here's the restaurant on that northeast corner with an outdoor dining area right there with 6 lanes of auto traffic going by, and they've done well. This is the big box back when it was a soundtrack. And this is the backside abutting an office-oriented street. But again, there's a secondary commercial pedestrian entrance, and there are a series of display cases that have murals displaying the products being sold in the store. So they're not actual storefront windows, because this is that backside of the big box, but they changed. over time. You know, they would change the displays, et cetera, so it was active and something to look at. Here's the street edge, and new buildings beginning to line that edge. And again, they were all mostly 2 stories. So it was always increasing the density a little bit as well. So this is not just adding a McDonald's along the edge, big difference. Here's the L-shaped building with the walkway through. So again, double fronted. Here you see standing at the intersection corner looking into the parking area and where the servicing is going on. And here we are in the parking lot looking out to the intersection, so that leads me to Target and to that restaurant. But it's defining the street edge there. Now this is the redeveloped area with its liner. Oh my God, it's a Verizon. I didn't. It changes to a Starbucks, but it was early on, it was a Verizon. But there's the building with the diagonal entrance across the street. So here's the southwest corner, with Verizon. But then it did become Starbucks Coffee. So this is a set of liner buildings, and the new big box is back here, which you'll see in a minute. So this is the before of that edge and the new liner building edge. Becoming more pedestrian friendly, linking in with our Pearl Street downtown. And here we see back where the big box is going to appear. There you begin to see it. At that point in time, it was a Circuit City. It's now, I've forgotten what it is now. But the other thing they did at that point in time was to be able to increase the density is there is a layer of parking underneath the big box. It's doable. And this is the service side, the side of it. Here's the back, here's the service bay tucked in like this, and it's shared between 2 big boxes. The other thing is this then inspired the development of the block beyond it, which is heading toward the Pearl Street Mall. This building, picking up some of the same palette right across the street, et cetera. And this attracted a small tech startup into that building. So this is an area in which redeveloping a big box strip commercial area became attractive to the creative class businesses. You know, now I don't think they would have been locating out on 28th Street when it was the auto dealership. I just don't believe it. So value was being created here. Now, I touched on the fact that McDonald's knew how to do it. Everyone knows how to do it when they're required to in some form or another. These are all franchise, drive-through fast food places, and they respond to context. Here's Burger King in a historic New England town in northern New Jersey. Here's Burger King in Avon, Colorado. You know, very, very different, responding to their context. They can do it. And examples of a couple other things. Here's Mackie D's in Steamboat Springs, trying to reflect the vernacular there. What's interesting, this is back in Goodyear, is that the drive-through areas have to be integrated architecturally into the building so that it's not just a line of cars out front. And they also have limitations on where the queuing window can be, so you can't have a queue of cars along the main street edge. And that leads to, they were struggling with this idea of when does the logo color of a building take over? And when does a building start being a corporate sign? And so we came up with some guidance about how much accent color is okay, but when it's the predominant color, then your building is going to be calculated as a sign, and you can't do that because the sign area limits don't allow that much sign. So there is an interaction in franchise architecture, I think, that we haven't had enough discussion about when the building becomes a sign. If we think we have the right to regulate signs, then we have a right to deal with that. Okay, where are we here? I think we, well, I'm going to finish up this section, and then we might because we're running ahead. I think we're doing fine on schedule, so we can take a break here in a minute just to give people, and we'll take a little bit of discussion. All right, this is also, I wanted to show a few other examples of repurposing a street, repurposing a sort of small strip mall. This is in Haley. And so what's interesting here is they took a double-loaded parking situation that had 2 diagonal rows. They eliminated one. They turned this into perpendicular. There's a drive lane right along the edge here. They have a wider sidewalk. But what's so interesting is that they've captured some parking spaces for outdoor uses that change the way in which you look at a small strip commercial building. So there's a hardware store that created a pad for product display, and another one that has it for a restaurant. And so this isn't exactly as far as Boulder has gone with putting the liner buildings up there. It's saying in this case, maybe there's some in-between design solutions that are at least moving us in the right direction and are enhancing the street edge. So I thought that was an interesting, creative solution from there. Bouncing back a little bit to big boxes and to Goodyear. They had already an intent statement, and we'll see it later on, about that all buildings should be considered in the round. There can't be a back side, a butt side to a building. But recognizing that certainly with commercial strip buildings and big boxes, et cetera, you can't say you gotta all have storefronts on the back side. That's not gonna make any sense either. So we came up with this hierarchical system of wall types, 3 wall types, a topology system. Type A walls are similar to what Mike described for the Main Street kind of context here, which is to have a certain percentage of glass and transparency. This is the most pedestrian oriented, needs to have a lot of glass and doors, et cetera, facing them. And these are written for all of their commercial districts and for their industrial zone properties as well. And it's amazing. You will see big industrial buildings that have beautiful backsides. The B type still has to have a higher degree of articulation and or windows, variation in wall surface, et cetera, than an A side, than the C side that you'll see, but less so than the A side. And then the C side still has to have a certain degree of design treatment to it. So, but the idea being is that all buildings are seen in the round, and that's the way they're going to be. And for them, there's actually a sort of a checklist of a recommendation of different design treatments for those different wall types that are considered in their design review process. But this is all corporate architecture in Goodyear. It's really, and what's interesting is it's part of the sprawl of Phoenix, but when you cross the city limits line, something changes. And there's something about the quality, the consistency of the palette, et cetera. Yet there's still a great deal of diversity and a lot of individual corporate identity. But there's something about this way it's done. The landscape is a key part of it. The way those edges are treated is certainly important. Connectivity is also a big concept, and we touched on that earlier, of as an individual parcel develops and or is planned, how are those pedestrian connections and now being thought about? Whereas in the past, we wouldn't have necessarily thought about that. In fact, we might have put up a fence. The other thing about corridors, though, that we have to think about is that they do have to be able to evolve over time and respond to individual property owners' needs. Now, these you can't really read, and I'll just sort of describe what's going on. This was a testing of some design guidelines, but with real property parcels lines, which weren't as neat and clean as we, it would have been nice if you could have just sort of said, we're going to put a building right here, but that happened to straddle 2 properties. So we had to look at how might this evolve? Who might actually replace a building? Who might just add on? How might parking be arranged? We were even illustrating how a natural feature, a little drainage with some trees, might be retained as an amenity within the site. So this was looking at how evolution of a strip could occur, retrofitting and creating a stronger internal circulation street through the property. You don't need to see the details. It's just recognizing that it's not going to happen overnight, and you have to acknowledge individual property owners and how they're going to respond to it. Okay, let's see. We'll move to transitions, and then we're doing fine for the moment. That edge between established single-family neighborhoods can happen in a variety of ways. And in a zone, you can actually start to describe what can happen here. And a couple of transition options might be parking with landscaping, which isn't really illustrated here, or a stepping down in scale. For example, these are carriage houses that then act as a smaller scale transition and a buffer a little bit from the commercial uses that are here. But it's all within a single zone boundary. It's not zoned separately, but you can actually have some of those different kinds of standards for those sensitive edges. Another example here of that kind of an illustration. These are guidelines from Cudahy, Wisconsin, a suburb of Minneapolis. But the idea is, as a corridor transforms and increases in density, then having some sort of a transitional use and or massing can be very valuable. I mentioned that introducing sustainability is very important, and one of the real important areas for that today to work with engineering departments is in low-impact development, low-impact design, and including those in the guidelines in terms of acknowledging that these kinds of treatments should be credited for any landscape requirement, but it's combining what would be a technical engineering requirement, perhaps, of how you handle stormwater and as part of the landscape. So including those kinds of principles is very, very important. Then real briefly, I'm not spending much time on residential. It's not out of neglect. It's just the nature of the timing of everything. But guidelines can look at compatibility in terms of mass and scale of individual buildings and provide guidance in terms of what would be appropriate for infill. And mixed-use projects that act as transitions into single-family neighborhoods can do so as well. This is back in Boulder on Pearl Street, but the opposite end of Pearl, where it's a quieter residential neighborhood behind this development. This is a mixed-use development that includes retail and office and several townhouses behind it. I'll walk you around the corner here. So here's again, the Pearl Street side. As you come around to the side, here you see the townhouses. These are all part of this single building. And there's a podium here where there's parking underneath because of the topography. But they are reflecting the traditional rhythm of the single-family houses that are beyond, but at a higher density. Just being sensitive to context and to those edges. And a similar one, houses here that have been converted to commercial use, but nonetheless have a certain scale and some new larger scale development. That was not reading very well. We won't spend much time on it. And then lastly, though, recognizing in the corridors that adaptive reuse is still something that needs to be taken in consideration. Not every property is going to transform and build to the street edge. And yet there's some very exciting and interesting things that can go on with these buildings. That said, sometimes our zoning already is too restrictive in terms of what you can do with these buildings, and that may require a visit. Sometimes it's the building code or health and safety requirements as opposed to what zoning can do, but sometimes it may have something to do with zoning. But seeing these kinds of buildings transform into fun new places is something that needs to be taken into consideration. So that's kind of an overview. Maybe I editorialized a little bit along the way about what some other people are doing in terms of some design situations that might have some similarities. So a quick discussion and response about what you've seen, and then we'll take a short break here. But anything you see that could apply? Yes?
Traffic speed between the residential areas and high-speed corridors.
about traffic speed. Well, certainly traffic speed is beyond what design addresses typically. That said, we will talk a little bit later about design standards for the public realm in terms of street sections, because the width of the travel lane can affect travel speed, especially in a neighborhood. And so from that standpoint, design standards and guidelines for residential street character versus an arterial character is important. Anyone else? Did you see anything there that's of use or value?
I have a quick question. When you were describing the interior parking, and especially on the intersection and the edge treatments of 28th and Pearl, is there any on-street parking at that intersection of Pearl?
There is not.
Okay.
There is not. No.
It's all being driven into the interior parking.
It's all being driven into the interior of the parking. I mean, that street section was established quite some time ago. That said, I believe now we have pretty much a continuous bike lane on that street, on both sides of the street, in addition to the travel and turn lanes. So it's...
What do you think about on-street parking? If you had the opportunity, would you do it there?
Well, certainly that is desired in many locations now, because it does help to buffer pedestrians from the automobile traffic, and can help meet some of the parking supply without creating those large surface lots. So, as an initial response, yes, it would be desirable in many places. It is now, at this stage of the game, kind of hard to envision it, just like on reserve. It's kind of hard to picture how that might work, But it is still a really good device.
We've had that conversation recently about Brook Street, because there's a portion of Brook Street where we could do on-street parking. In fact, there is on-street parking. It's not used. But as that corridor transitions we've talked about, would it be desirable to keep that on-street parking?
I think, yeah, now that one, I can see that might be worth looking at on Brooks, because it would have some traffic calming and giving a sense of confidence to pedestrians. And there certainly are options where it's located to actually protect bike lanes as well, depending on the different street section and the traffic volumes. That is, of course, a part of the whole concept of complete streets, that you're beating several uses rather than just through traffic flow in that curb-to-curb section. So, other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
With the kind of liner building idea with the parking behind, is that it's pretty suburban, and it turns into just kind of a tacky strip mall, and all the cars are in the back, and that's better than reserve with acres of parking out front. But nobody uses the sidewalk. You've got your liner building and an empty sidewalk and some landscaping, and there's nobody out there. There's traffic, there's an empty sidewalk, and then there's cars, everybody's driving back.
Well, there are certainly examples where, even though you've made this gesture of creating a storefront edge, all of the energy is actually on the other side. But I would say on that 28th Street example, I'd say there's at least 10% of the pedestrian traffic is on that sidewalk. Now, if the street were tamed more, it might even improve. I'm certainly not saying in that situation that is going to be the primary entrance to those buildings. Now, on several narrower corridors, it is quite possible to literally, in many of those cases, you're not going to have a big box behind. You're just going to flip the building to the front and have parking behind. And those areas, you will see more energy, because that is a primary access point for a lot of those kinds of businesses. So part of it will depend on the street section and the traffic volumes as to how effective they're going to be. And transit would very much play into it as well. It does.
Rather than a one-story stucco Verizon stores, it's an apartment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's what I wanted to point out, is most of those liner buildings were 2 stories now. A lot of those had that added use upstairs, whether it was office or residential. Yes?
How did those 2-story buildings, especially where there's residential on top, mixed-use buildings, do you usually see that done with incentives, and what kind of incentives are there for that? Or are you seeing that in code?
Well, I think in many of these cases now it's the market, because for many communities right now, the residential market's hot. You know, there is demand for housing. And if you're permitted to do it, you can do it. The obstacles often have been meeting the parking requirements and or whether or not the land use even allowed it. And so as codes get reformed to allow housing above and to accommodate the ideas of sharing parking so that you're not required to meet a lot of additional parking requirements on site, I think you'll see people doing that. Now, in terms of affordable housing, you know, that's a different question in terms of whether or not there are assistance programs for that to happen. Now, there have been codes that literally required 2 stories minimum. I'm not too comfortable about those because of, you know, if the market isn't there to support it or not. But a lot of those were written in places where at the time certainly the economy was strong and there was the assumption that you could require it, that it was reasonable to require that, with the argument that it's making more efficient use of land and that if you allow a 1-story building to occur, that's going to lock up that property at that scale for another 50 years, potentially. And that's a big concern in trying to retrofit corridors. So you know, that's what's at play in some of those situations.
So just to follow up on the parking, which I think is, you know, one of the biggest challenges. I read an interaction between the creators of SimCity, and they were asked, did you use real cities as models? And the designers of SimCity says, no, we didn't do any parking, because when we looked at real cities, we couldn't believe how much parking was really out there and needed. So what kind of tools are people using and communities using to help the private market and the private sector with parking? Are you seeing incentives for, because, you know, it's just so expensive to do structured parking, and how are people helping these areas that are redeveloping to build structured parking and incentivize it? And then also, what kind of tools for shared parking are you seeing?
Well, parking districts where a series of property owners together help fund parking in a concentrated space that allows them all to build to a higher density. The numbers have to work, certainly, is one way of doing that. And that can be through a parking authority where you can issue bonds for construction of that parking facility, is a real basic tool that a lot of communities are using. And the other part of the question was, I've lost it now, what you were asking. Oh, and just sharing, shared parking. Yeah, we're rethinking the ratios and the numbers, and sometimes it may be wishful thinking that we can reduce the numbers as low as we do. And for a while, we were seeing lenders requiring more parking than the codes required because they weren't confident about the sharing of parking. But I think there's more information and more evidence now coming in showing where that can work, that would allow you to reduce parking ratio requirements to help reduce some of that burden. And that's where, of course, the idea that residential use is compatible with commercial below is that those users can be sharing that space. And certainly from our personal experience in our development where we are officed, it is a mixed-use environment like that, and we see the turnover. The street is full of cars, on-street parking during the day of office users. 5 o'clock-ish, there's a change and a turnover, and then all of a sudden the street's parked again and an hour later, and the lights are on in all the apartments above our offices. So it does work, and as we learn more about which numbers are the right numbers, I think we'll see a greater level of comfort from the lenders in terms of supporting those kinds of projects.
Just one more about transit and fixed route transit and how that can impact development and incentivize development. Are you seeing communities where there are nodes built up around fixed, transit stops and, less need for parking, and developers seeing sort of those areas as a place to build confidently because there's fixed? Certainly
fixed rail we all know that transit-oriented development around a fixed rail stop is showing huge results because you know that stop's going to be there. It ain't moving. And so there are lots now of examples around the country of that working. The bus rapid transit is the in-between solution between just regular bus routes, where there may actually be a fixed travel lane for the buses, or at least something that is pretty dedicated, and often they will actually have shelters that are more formal and less likely to move at some of those key points. We are seeing that. We worked on a corridor plan in Fort Collins, Colorado, where a bus rapid transit system is a part of the corridor, and we are seeing now those mixed-use, larger scale mixed-use projects coming in near those stops. There are, I think, every 2 blocks as you're approaching the downtown area. And so, yes, we're starting one, and we'll let you know, right, Brad? We're starting a corridor plan in Anchorage right now that is going to be transit-oriented around fixed stops. That is the objective, is to do that. I'm less informed personally about the data on just fixed transit stops and their benefits, but I mean, logically, if I as a developer can rely on the fact that that stop is going to be nearby and know that it's going to stay in that location, then it seems to me that I'd be willing to invest in that area. Certainly we're seeing a population now, the millennials we all hear about, will take transit. They would prefer to take transit when they can. And that's a huge demographic and behavioral shift that we are seeing around the country.
Yeah, the cases showed examples of formalized judgment. And what I'm wondering again is there ever any difference given to professional judgment, which often takes into account the time, place, all the particulars versus the things that get cast as, they all represent some kind of value system, but they get formalized in a way in these principles.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question, because I mean, a lot of those are projects where I think the developer had they had certain requirements they had to meet, but in terms of the actual building design solutions and things like that, they weren't necessarily dictated. Again, it was a percentage of glass, you have to orient to the street, et cetera, but you know, how much building you're building and what it looked like architecturally. For most of those situations, that was not dictated. The downtown Boulder solutions probably had a higher degree of scrutiny in terms of architectural detail and materials than some of the others. So yes, some things were prescribed. But I also tried to show a few examples there where there were voluntary or advisory systems. Some of them were incentive-based. You know, the MRA is certainly an example of that, where they have the leverage within a renewal area to say, we will help this project if you meet our guidelines. There are several examples like that around the country. So there's a spectrum of the way they're applied, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, about the different ways in which these standards and guidelines are used, from totally advisory to totally regulatory, and there's some in between. Okay, why don't we take a 15-minute break? That wasn't really on the schedule, but I think we've got the opportunity to do it here, and then we'll resume with looking at specifically how some of the tools work for this. So back at, well, try to make it 10. Back at the top of the hour if you can.